Hello, people of all sizes, with dreams of all sizes. My name is Miss Ng. I'm from the Shaler North Hills Library. This evening's bedtime biography is another one from the Mike Venezia series. This one, Getting to Know the World's Greatest Artists, and this is about George Gershwin, an amazing composer. George Gershwin was born in New York City in 1898. He became one of America's greatest composers. He is known for his beautiful, exciting concert pieces, as well as for the popular music he wrote for plays and movies. George was one of the first composers to mix symphonic music with popular music of the day. He came up with a whole new American sound. At the time George was born, America didn't really have a serious classical music style of its own. Most American composers borrowed ideas from great European composers like Beethoven, Bach, and Chopin. There was a new kind of popular music, though, and that was very American. It was called jazz. Jazz was invented by African American musicians who used ideas from lots of different styles of music. They often combined work songs from slave times and religious folk songs called spirituals with an exciting beat and rhythm. Two other styles of music that helped make up jazz were ragtime and blues. The musicians who made up most of the music as they went along, and played the way they felt at the moment. Because of this, notes were never written down, and pieces never sounded exactly the same way. When George was little, New York City was a pretty rough and tough place to grow up. Neighborhoods were crowded, and there weren't many parks or playgrounds around, so kids had to play on the streets. George enjoyed playing street hockey and stickball. He also learned to fight pretty well, too, and he was one of the best roller skaters around. George didn't seem to have much of an interest in music until one day, when he was 7 or 8 years old, George was roller skating through a neighborhood in New York called Harlem. Harlem was filled with restaurants and clubs where jazz bands played. George never forgot the exciting, lively beat of the music. Excuse me, I'm a little late today. Would you guys mind starting over from the beginning? He often roller skated or hitched rides back to Harlem, just so he could sit outside of the restaurants and clubs and listen. A short time later, George heard some classical violin music being played from an open window. He loved the beautiful sound. The kids in George's neighborhood thought only nerds were interested in music, but George didn't care what anyone thought. After that day, he decided he would learn everything he could about music right away. What happened? Somebody called George a wimp. Remember, George was kind of good at fighting, too. George started going to free concerts where he enjoyed listening to classical music. He even experimented with making up his own songs on a friend's piano. When George was 12, a wonderful thing happened. His parents bought a piano. It was really for George's older brother, Ira. Everyone in the family was very surprised when George started playing the piano as soon as he saw it. If you think the song is great, wait till you hear my next one. And he's playing on it there before the movers even have it sitting where it's going to sit. George was lucky to find excellent piano teachers in New York City when he started taking lessons. By the time he was 15, he was good enough to get a job playing the piano at a company that wrote songs and printed sheet music. It was in an area of New York City called Tin Pan Alley. Singers and other show business people would stop by to listen to new songs for their acts. It was about the only way someone could hear a new song, since there weren't any radios yet, and most people didn't have record players. George got to meet some famous people, like Fred Astaire and his sister Adele. Sometimes George played his own songs for them. George's songs were so lively and so fun to listen to that it wasn't long before one of them became a big hit. It was called Swanee. A famous singer of the day, Al Jolson, heard George play Swanee at a party and decided to sing it in his Broadway show. From then on, George found it easier to get jobs writing his own music instead of just playing the music of other composers. George sometimes asked his brother Ira to write words for the songs. Even though George and Ira were very different types of people, hardly anyone worked better together when it came to making music. George and Ira both enjoyed painting too. Next to writing music, painting was George's favorite thing to do. George was becoming well known all over New York. He started getting invited to parties given by rich and famous people. Often George was asked to play his music at the parties. He never seemed to mind, and sometimes he played all night long. Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. Come on, everybody, join in. One person who liked George's music a lot was a jazz band leader named Paul Whiteman. Paul thought it was about time to prove that there was important music coming from America and being written by American composers. He decided to put on a serious concert. Paul asked George Gershwin to write a symphonic, jazz-style piece for his concert. George thought Paul Whiteman's idea was great. This was his chance to show how important American music could be. George called his new musical piece Rhapsody in Blue. He wanted his music to have the sounds of modern America so that everyone could enjoy it. George wrote parts of Rhapsody in Blue while on a train trip. The noise of the steel wheels on the tracks and the train's clickety-clack rhythm gave George lots of ideas for his new music. He often heard music in the noise of machines and traffic and in other big city sounds. Okay, everybody at this construction site, when I count to 3, here we go. Ready? This is going to be a great song. Paul Whiteman's concert took place on February 12, 1924. People all over the country tuned into their radios, and the concert hall was packed. Besides George, Paul had invited other popular American composers to play their newest music. For the first hour or so, things didn't seem to go so well. People didn't find the music very new or interesting, and some of them were even getting bored. And then it was George's turn. George was at the piano, and Paul Whiteman led the orchestra. Hardly anyone could believe their ears. Rhapsody in Blue began with a clarinet making a long, whooping, laughing kind of sound that never had been heard before. Next, the orchestra joined in, and finally George Gershwin began playing. When it was over, people couldn't stop clapping. They loved it. I need someone who can make an unusual whooping sound for my new Rhapsody. Well, Mr. Gershwin, if I can't get it done, no one can. Rhapsody in Blue made George Gershwin famous all over the world. He went on to write a lot more music for the theater and for movies, much of it with his brother Ira. Many of George and Ira's songs became hits and are still popular today. George continued to write symphonic music too, like Concerto in F and An American in Paris. George Gershwin's favorite musical piece was his opera Porgy and Bess. An opera is like a play, except that the actors sing instead of speak the words. Porgy and Bess was different from other operas, though. It was about poor African-American fishermen who lived in a waterfront area of South Carolina called Catfish Row. George traveled to South Carolina and stayed near the people he was writing about so that he could learn more about them and make his music sound really authentic. When Porgy and Bess first played in New York City, some people didn't like it. They weren't sure if it was a serious opera or a play or a musical comedy. George was disappointed. He knew his opera was probably the best thing he'd ever done. George explained in a newspaper article that Porgy and Bess was a new kind of opera, a folk opera. It was about real, everyday people. The opera's music, too, was like the lives of real people. Sometimes the songs were fun and happy, and other times they were serious or sad. Over the years, people began to understand Porgy and Bess. Today, it is one of the world's most popular operas. George Gershwin died in 1937. His music sounds as new and exciting today as it did when he first wrote it. Sometimes George used other things besides instruments to get just the right mood or sound. In An American in Paris, he used real taxi horns. In Second Rhapsody, he used a fly swatter. The best way to get to know George Gershwin is to listen to his music. Since it's as popular as ever, it's pretty easy to find it on the radio, and this is a pretty old book, you can tell. And you can also borrow tapes and CDs at many libraries. We still do have CDs here at the library, but you can also find a lot of his music online, and I'll put some links to that too. So my dear friends, I am very hopeful that you will have enjoyed a wonderful day outside and that you will be going to bed tonight with lots of dreams and with glad hearts for the kind of day that you had with your loved ones. Thank you so much for sharing another day with us at the library. Kiss your beautiful brains. Kiss your loving and creative hearts. And they're open and full of kindness. And look in that mirror and say, hey, good looking, because you're all good looking, just the way you are. Thank you, my friends. Have a good night.